Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Julianne. I'm the Research and Programs Coordinator at the Banff Sport Medicine Foundation. And I am very excited to welcome our expert guest speaker tonight, Jake Watson. So Jake, if you don't know him, he's an exercise physiologist and owner and founder of Intrepid Performance Training. So fun facts, Jake is originally from Western Australia. So he's an Aussie just like I am, who now bases himself here in the Bow Valley. And when he's not working with clients either in person or virtually, you can find him out mountain biking, snowboarding, and working on his newfound Canadian hobby of hockey. So welcome, Jake. Oh, just before we get going, before I turn it over to Jake, just a couple of housekeeping things. So what we're going to do tonight in terms of if you have a question that pops up, just type it into the chat. And what we're going to do is Jake is going to go through and answer those at the end of the presentation tonight. When they come up, just write them in the chat, but just keep in mind that we'll address them at the end of Jake's presentation. The other thing too that you'll see when you log out, we just ask, there's a really quick, like a 1-minute survey that will pop up on your screens at the end of the presentation. If you could just take that 1 minute to answer those few questions, that would be amazing. It helps us at the foundation kind of get an idea of what other topics would be good to get guest speakers in to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to you, Jake. So thank you, Jake, for joining us tonight.
Beauty. Thanks for the intro. Let's see if we can share across here. Screen. Beauty. All right, that worked a lot smoother than in practice. Alrighty, guys. Well, welcome to the presentation. I thought I'd sit here in front of the picture of the bull with horns to add a little perspective with the lack of hair I've got on the camera. But what we're going to do today is basically go through and give you a bit of a guide on not only improving the shoulder, but maintaining that shoulder performance you've got. So this is presuming you've kind of got like a decently healthy shoulder and is picking up any of those abnormalities that might be coming about and restricting you from getting that ultimate performance there. So we're going to have a bit of a look at the key players, those things that can, those main key players that control the shoulder, control the performance of the shoulder. Look at some self-assessment tools. Look what we can do in relation to applications to change any of those things that come up in our self-assessment. Talk about stability versus strength in the shoulder. And then finish off with some training applications. So we're not going to deep dive too much in the anatomy physiology aspect. We'll get a bit of an understanding as to what makes the shoulder work or tick, so that you guys have a better understanding of those applications down the track. So a few of you might have a pretty good understanding, come from a health background. Others, it might be the first time talking about these joints. Your shoulder is basically a ball and socket joint. It's got a huge range of motion. And it's a joint that we'd like to say is functionally stable. So what that means is basically the shoulder by itself doesn't have a lot of stability, has a lot of movement. That's then resulted in a bit of a lack of stability structurally, compared to, say, the hip joint that's quite deep into the socket, or the ankle joint that's quite structurally stable there as well. So basically, the shoulder doesn't just comprise that ball and socket, but actually the 4 joints that kind of help influence the shoulder are your glenohumeral joint, your acromioclavicular joint, your sternoclavicular joint, and your scapulothoracic joint. So the acromioclavicular and the sternoclavicular don't really do much in the way of movement. They're more ligament-based joints, whereas the glenohumeral and scapulothoracic joint are the ones that end up influencing movement a lot. Okay, so what stabilizes the shoulder after that? The main players here we're looking at are the rotator cuff muscles. So these rotator cuff muscles I think it's pretty well known that you've got rotator cuff muscles, but what's often not known is that there's 4 muscles that comprise the rotator cuff group. And they've got like a unified function. So they might have their own actions, like the supraspinatus helps to abduct the shoulder and keep it quite tight to the joint, so keep the shoulder in place. We've got the infraspinatus and the teres minor that help to externally rotate the shoulder. And then the subscapularis that helps to internally rotate the shoulder. So those are all the different actions they have, but their unified function is basically to stabilize that shoulder or keep it close to the joint, rather than thinking of them as just muscles that do actions there as well. So if anyone's been to the gym and seen this exercise or has done this exercise before, and thought they were working their rotator cuff muscles, I can tell you that you're not doing that at all. You're basically doing an isometric bicep curl and squeezing your shoulder blades together. So when we look at those rotator cuff muscles, they obviously work in the different planes with their rotation and also the flexion. What we're doing here is basically just holding a dumbbell and then swinging our arms out. So we're going to kind of break down some of these misconceptions when it comes to working the rotator cuff muscles to ensure that we're working the shoulder the way that we should be. Okay, so when we look at that rotator cuff muscle group just a little bit more with action versus function, we don't really want to look at improving the rotator cuff muscle strength solely. So if we're looking at just loading the rotator cuff muscle group by grabbing a band, a cable, externally rotating or internally rotating with that load, we're kind of loading the action of the rotator cuffs rather than challenging the function of the rotator cuff muscles. So this is beneficial to load the action kind of post-surgery. If you're an older client coming in, adding a little bit of strength into those movements, or if you're new to like strength and conditioning, so say like a young athlete or someone that hasn't been in the strength and conditioning realm in the way of a gym or loading tissue previously. And there is a bit of a crossover in regards to how that strength then improves the stability of the shoulder. However, that has a bit of a limited ceiling. So you're not going to keep improving the function of those rotator cuff muscles by just getting them stronger there as well. And obviously, when we look at that shoulder joint, if I can get up a little bit so you can see me there, if we're looking at challenging it through its action and keeping it really close to the body, we're not really challenging its function in the way of stability. Having that elbow or the shoulder further away from the body allows for less stability and a little bit more challenge in regards to your rotator cuff stability or shoulder stability and the actions of those rotator cuff muscles there as well. Alrighty. So the scapular-thoracic joints, we're going to break down that guy or that joint a little bit more now. Now, scapular-thoracic joint, or for instance, looking at this glenohumeral or scapulohumeral rhythm, is an interesting one to talk about because unlike the ball and socket joint, there's not really anything in the outside world or the laws that exist in the outside world that can help kind of describe the way that scapular-thoracic joint works. So we'll go into a little bit of it, but for the most part, your scapula wants to try and stay close to your thoracic spinal rib cage to help support and stabilize the shoulder through a lot of its functions. And if we look at the actual shoulder movement of flexion, you can see in that picture there on the side that we've got, if we went for 180 degrees of flexion in your shoulder, you'll find that 120 comes from the action of your glenohumeral joint. So what we'd see as that ball and socket joint. And the last 60 happens to come from the scapular-humeral rhythm. So basically the scapula moving with the humerus there. It's not the last 60, it's basically like every 1/3 is 2/3 in relation to the ratio. So it's not that you go just solely in one and then all the way through the other. It kind of helps as it goes through. It gives us a bit of an idea of how we need to address all the joints that have functions within the shoulder to actually improve the shoulder overall performance. So we can't just solely look at, say, the rotator cuff muscles or specifically at the glenohumeral joint and the actions that work there. We also need to make sure that we're addressing everything that comprises around that scapular thoracic joint, as well as the other joints that kind of influence the shoulder there. So the other one that we didn't really talk about from a joint perspective, because it's more just comprises a section of your anatomy, there is your thoracic spine there as well. So your thoracic spine has a bit of an influence on the shoulder and how it moves, and whether it's going to have limitations in its movement. So if we've got stiffness or maybe adaptations or asymmetries in our thoracic spine, then we're going to have issues with how we move our shoulder there as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how the kind of scapular humeral rhythm would work, that some of you guys might have come across this in your visits to physiotherapists or trainers in the past there. But basically, these movements that we've got in the shoulder, so the flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, this internal rotation, external rotation, is what's happening at this joint. At a scapulothoracic, this elevation, depression, retraction, protraction, pretty well-known movements, I'd say, for most folks around the shoulder blade. These are movements that help support general demands that the shoulder are requiring from it. The other two that happen to, I guess, work a lot is this upward rotation and downward rotation. So this upward rotation is to show you this next slide here is this picture on the far left here. So what's happening here is what we were talking about in relation to this 60 degrees of scapular movement that can assist with that shoulder flexion. You've got three muscles trying to pull the shoulder blade in this upward rotation movement that allows for more space to happen, to open up in that glenohumeral joint to allow the shoulder to come up above the head. So if we wanted to look at that and see what might work well in the movement compared to what might work, or what is not working so well, we can look at this video here. So in this video here, play it a couple of times. You might not see too much going on with it. Here on the left side, we've got some good upward rotation of the scapula. You can see the scapula getting out of the way as the shoulder raises up above head height. And we got that good upward rotation as the shoulder comes up. On the right-hand side here, let's see if we can get it going again. You're going to see less of that upward rotation there. So limitation in this upward rotation on the right-hand side, it's going to be restricting the amount of movement or restricting the movement that he has in his right-hand shoulder. So we're breaking down some of the movements of the shoulder joint there. Okay, one thing that I'll bring up a bit like that external rotation is the shoulders back and down. So shoulders back and down, I think we get into the routine of using quite a lot as trainers or as therapists as an easy kind of approach to addressing this rounding of the shoulders that goes forward. And what we need to do with that shoulders back and down is just a simple change in posture that opens everything up. Now, the problem with the shoulders back and down is that we're trying to address probably postural issues that have more complex reasons for being the way they are, rather than just needing a straightforward shoulders back and down. But the second thing that becomes a problem with that is if you've got your shoulders back and down and try to do anything, like if you had a boxer, for instance, have their shoulders back and down, they're going to be punching like a T-Rex and they're not going to be able to get their arms moving anywhere. If you're doing that in any movements that you're trying to make through life, you're kind of restricting the amount of movement through your shoulder blades because you've pinned your shoulders back and not allowing them to kind of move through all their ranges to support the shoulder through its different positions when you require the shoulder to be in different positions. One of those key players is this Serratus Interior. So we kind of brushed over some of the key players of stabilizers, being the rotator cuff muscles. Looked at some of the scapular humeral rhythm that helps with that stability, so supporting the shoulder joint. Another big key player in there is his Serratus Interior, and this is a guy that helps your shoulder blades stick nice and tight to your rib cage, so kind of avoids that winging movement that can often happen in the shoulder blades. And if you're doing a shoulders back and down movement or shoulders back movement, you're really contracting the rhomboids, which is muscles in your mid back there, that oppose the movement of Serratus Interior there. So if the Serratus Interior help us go into this upward rotation, for instance, and we've pulled our shoulders back, we can't then use our Serratus Interior to support that shoulder with the movement of upward rotation. It'd be similar to this reciprocal inhibition, would be similar to like trying to touch your shoulder with the with one hand. So you've tensed your bicep and then said, all right, I want you to really tense your tricep now. And you've kind of inhibited your ability to tense your tricep because you've squished your bicep into full contraction. You've not allowed the tricep to extend. So it's the body's way of stopping that co-contraction there. Okay, so that was a bit of a kind of shotgun look at your shoulder and the key joints, the key structures that support the shoulder stability, and some of the key joints that allow us to move the shoulder in a functional or higher performing, or with higher performance. What we want to do now is work out basically how do we keep all these joints in optimal function, and how do we make sure that they're performing at the optimal level. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation is basically give you a bit of a breakdown of like the four functional subcomponents that influence the shoulder, how to kind of review those to be able to get an idea of where your performance is, and then some strategies to go about addressing any of those dysfunctions there. So these four functional subcomponents are your thoracic mobility, your scapular position, your glenohumeral internal rotation, and your posterior shoulder position. So each is a prerequisite for the next. So your thoracic mobility is a prerequisite for your scapular position. Your scapular position is a prerequisite for your glenohumeral internal rotation bias. And your glenohumeral internal rotation bias is a prerequisite for your posterior shoulder position, or your scapular thoracic position there as well. So what we're looking at doing is going through and finding out if we don't have a shoulder that feels like it's working at optimal level, identifying the biggest problem of dysfunction, and then determining the central cause of that pain or dysfunction, and then addressing it at one of these levels. So it's an approach that's going to mean that we don't have such a narrow thought process, and we open up that broader picture. So instead of thinking like, well, my pecs are tight, I just got to stretch my pecs and I'm going to open up into better shoulder position. That might help a little bit, but we've got to remember that each of these levels has a bit of an influence on the next. So if we've got a tight pec, then we've probably got bias in how our thoracic spine is, or mobility is on that side, which has also a bias on what our scapula is doing on that side, which also has a bias on how much we internally rotate, or our internal rotation bias on that side as well. So we want to try and find the central cause and then clean up the peripheral stuff from there. So I'm going to give you guys a bit of a go-to of what I would look at in regards to assessing where the shoulder should be from a functional standpoint. Now, these assessments, they're going to be different across therapists when they're assessing the shoulder, and they're not aligned to any specific shoulder injury at any sort. They're just generally looking at the main functional subcomponents and working out whether you can determine any abnormalities or asymmetries when you're looking through these areas. So the thoracic spine being one of the big influences on the shoulder function, we want to have a look at your postural bias. So whether you've got more of a kyphotic or excessive kyphotic posture in your thoracic spine, whether it's got a bit of lordosis or like a flat positioning in your back, it's going to give us an idea of where you're biased towards a more compressed or more expanded position. But that's just a static posture. Ideally, we want to have a look at how you move. So the thoracic spine looks at flexion and extension as well as rotation. So getting into a position like a cat-cow position and hinging into that cat-cow position either filming it yourself or having someone look at it and see whether you hinge evenly throughout that thoracic spine into your lumbar spine, or whether you find when you go into this cat-cow position that you're only really just moving in one area of the spine. So you often see people leveraging a lot of movement in their lumbar spine rather than kind of moving through their thoracic spine. The other one in the way of movement is rotation. So the guide down here, the picture down the bottom here, would be how we could set up an assessment on rotation. So putting a ball between someone's knees just allows us not to rotate by just using our pelvis there as well. So you have to keep the ball or whatever between your knees, and the knees pointing straight. It means that we're isolating for that rotation in the thoracic spine there. With that thoracic spine rotation, we're kind of looking at aiming to get towards like 30 degrees or 35 degrees each way. So that's kind of your go-to for range, but at the same time, you're also trying to compare the asymmetries. So what that means is, do you rotate one way and it's really, really good movement? Do you rotate the other way and it's pretty restricted in the movement there? The next thing we'd look at is, your shoulder flexion. So with the shoulder flexion, when we raise the shoulders up, if you see this guy on the left, it looks like he's got a really good amount of shoulder flexion. So bring his arms up. But when he then is asked to not extend through his lumbar spine, you can see that the true range is shown there. So suddenly we've got a limitation that he can't get to 180 degrees, and we're trying to work out what is bringing that about. If we had someone up against the wall, we can kind of get that true range and then get a measure of how far you're going there in relation to the shoulder flexion. So we're looking for 180 degrees. And if you're not quite at 180 or one arm's a lot different to the other, then we know that we need to address something at that level there as well. The next test or assessment I'd go through would be to look at your rotation in your shoulder there. So remembering when we look at rotation, we have the two muscles in the rotator cuffs that help externally rotate and the one that internally rotates. With your internal rotators of your shoulder, these aren't the only things that rotate your shoulder externally or internally, but these are the stabilizers. You generally have a lot more muscles that help internally rotate the shoulder, and you're going to have more of a bias to that rotation as well. But this test here is just going to get an idea of whether you've got any restrictions in that external or internal rotation. So if you can, get over your head and reach back. This external rotation position is basically this guy in the middle here, where you're trying to reach and scratch down your upper back. We're trying to look to see that you get close towards that T3, T4, so that's your thoracic vertebrae level, and whether that's the same on the other side. And then the opposing would be the internal rotation. So seeing whether we can actually bring your hand up towards that level of the 8th vertebrae. And again, whether it's the same on the left or right, just to determine how the function's going. Here you can see with this girl in her right shoulder there, she's got quite a bit of winging in her shoulder. So a lot of instability potentially in the shoulder when she brings it into external rotation in relation to, say, that Serratus Interior activating to keep that shoulder blade there. Not that we need to get into that, more just look at your ranges. Can you get up there to the T4? Can you get to the T8? If you can't, alrighty, we put a measure of where you started from. Okay, and this obviously charming lad looking at his active range of motion here. So I couldn't find a photo or video of this on the internet, so I had to use myself. But basically, this last test or assessment, the first few are really looking at your range of motion from just a more of a mobility sense. This assessment I like to use is just more of a gauge as to what your active range of motion is. So are you able to raise your arm up into that flexion or that forward flexion with your hand rotated so that your pinky finger's kind of leading the way? So you're trying to have it so that your palm stays in that flat position. If you're getting towards 120 degrees, if we revert back to what I had mentioned before about the glenohumeral joint and the scapulohumeral rhythm, knowing that we have 180 degrees of motion, 2/3 come from the glenohumeral, 1/3 comes from the scapulohumeral rhythm. So we're basically giving you an assessment of like the arena of your stability, how you're activating those external rotators in the rotator cuff group, and whether you can maintain that position with the activation of your Serratus Interior. If you see my picture here, this wasn't me faking it. This is how pathetic my right shoulder is due to previous adventures that damaged the shoulder there, whereas that's a lot healthier. So I could probably raise my left arm up to about 120 degrees, which tells me that, yeah, I'm happy to load above my head because I know I can control that shoulder joint well through an active range of 120 degrees. Whereas I only got to 90 degrees here and my hand started to turn inwards. And I know at that position, I'm unable to kind of control that range or that active range beyond there. So what do we do with all this information? So we've got a few tests there, that just a few that I've kind of used myself, and all these kind of assessments and information that I've given you tonight is something or things that I've gathered from smarter people than myself over the years, and then brought together to try and apply within my practice, and then hopefully for you to apply within your practice. So when you've looked at those assessments, we can see whether there's the differences left or right, whether you're miles off the range of motion you need, or way out of the range of 120 degrees in regards to active stability, or not able to move your thoracic spine so well. We can then look at these prerequisites, work out what needs to be addressed as a result of looking at them, and then use the following interventions to try and address them. So rather than these next few slides where we're going to look at how we address them as solely the only exercises that you do on your shoulder, try and think of these exercises or interventions as things that you want to integrate into your programming that you have already, into your sport prior to going into it. So say if you're a rock climber and you've identified that there's restrictions in your shoulder movement, restrictions in your thoracic mobility, that you integrate some of these exercises or interventions prior to then going into the gym wall or out on a climb outside, as a means of opening yourself up to these ranges, so you're able to control them through your sport there. So going back to those 4 functional subcomponents, knowing that they all influence each other, let's have a look at how we can kind of open up that thoracic mobility. So you've had a look at your thoracic mobility, for instance, realize that there's a few things we need to do on it. We're going to presume that you've gone through that whole wallop of assessments, and we're not absolutely primo on everything. And if we are, we want to try and bring in some of these interventions prior to then going into your sports, or prior then to going into your gym sessions. So thoracic mobility, we've got those 2 movements, the flexion extension and that rotation. That cat-cow position that we did before was really good for assessing whether we have a bias in one area or the other. But then when we're training thoracic mobility, if we've got a bias in the area, we're likely going to keep doing the movement of that area. So by doing a thoracic extension, through flexion extension of the spine with your butt down on your heels here, we can kind of restrict the amount of mobility that's coming from your lower back there. So it's a good way of kind of honing in on just your thoracic spine rather than leveraging off all the ranges of motion that you've got coming out of your lower back there. If we look at rotation, there's a couple of exercises. We're looking at things that help us restrict the movement through any other area of the spine or hips. So this one here is just a book opener. This one's a thoracic thread the needle, or thread the needle, not thoracic, thread the needle, that you could use to try and then open up that range. So you're kind of using these as almost like keys to open the door to then leverage the full performance of your shoulder. That improvement in thoracic mobility after one of the few exercises there, then we'll have an influence on our scapular thoracic control. So now we're looking at the scapular thoracic control, which we haven't really looked at in the testing. And we're going to have a means of improving both your upward rotation as well as your general scapular-humeral or scapular-thoracic, rhythm between these couple of exercise examples. So this wall slide here, I'll just show you again, allows us to kind of get into a position where we're biasing the scapula into working towards upward rotation. So you're creating a bit of external rotation, you're pressing through your Serratus Interior, and it's a real good exercise that we can use to try and open up that upward rotation of the shoulder. And you might slide that in prior to the session if you've got that limitation of raising the arm above head height through that shoulder flexion or through that palm facing up shoulder raise. Where these IYTs or YTIs come in as a great intervention is, again, with that thoracic, with that shoulder flexion and palm up shoulder raise. But usually when you're getting to a point where you've actually got some good control in that range, but you just find that when you do those movements, we're getting a little bit more activation in that shrugging motion, rather than allowing for us to move the shoulder through that healthy range. Okay, so we've opened those two gateways. We might go back and test our movements again. Apologies, I've had COVID 2 weeks ago and I'm still coughing, so bear with me with the hydration here. The third thing we're looking at is now reducing that internal bias. So when we say internal bias, we're looking at the fact that we've got a lot more muscles and larger muscles that help to internally rotate the shoulder. So we want to have a go at trying to address the tension that can come about from just the activation of these muscles. The big one that people go to straight away is your pecs. We see the shoulders rolling forward, presume the pecs are quite tight, do a bit of release through the pecs there and kind of leave anything posterior in the shoulder. But it kind of makes sense to maybe look at the lats initially. So the lats are an internal rotator of the shoulder. They also kind of attach to your thoracic, they attach to your thoracic spine at the lower half and into your lumbar spine. So it kind of makes sense. They don't have just an influence on the shoulder. They also have an influence on your thoracic spine. So it makes sense to kind of release them as well. This guy here, this posterior shoulder release or myofascial release to the shoulder is a good means of trying to get out of that added tension coming from the lats. And with myofascial release, what we're doing there, without kind of going into the deep detail of myofascial release, is we're creating a stimulus in the body that creates a subsequent kind of down regulation of the tension in the tissue that then allows us to kind of open up into a bit more range of motion by reducing the tension of that tissue that might be restricting that range of motion. So doing that myofascial release on the lats, maybe the pecs, maybe into the delts, depending on what area gives you the most feedback in regards to kind of a trigger, will help open up that or help reduce that tension. Now with that myofascial release comes the kind of I guess prescription that you don't want to just be doing it to give yourself a light little massage. So if you're like jumping on a foam roller and just up and down having a good old chat without any kind of real kickback and stimulus, then we're not really working at a high enough amount of stimulus on that trigger to really relax the tissue there. The other thought is to then reduce that internal bias by opening up through stretching. Again, a bit of an area that people talk about conflictingly around what should be good for in regards to stretching. If you're tense in any area, holding a stretch for a long period of time is going to really allow you to open up that tissue through that relaxing of the tissue into deeper ranges there. Here we've got this is Chris, one of the other trainers. He's a better looking lad than I am, doing a bit of a passive stretch there that's similar to a child's pose, but a little bit more bias on that external rotation. So this is a great example of him getting his shoulders into a larger amount of shoulder flexion, has the hands turned out, elbows in, and that's really opening up all those internal rotators that restrict that shoulder flexion movement. So it's another bit of ammo to potentially add to your the prerequisites to your full components of function in the shoulder. Okay, the last one, the posterior shoulder. So kind of looking at that scapular, thoracic, scapulohumeral, relationship. So generally the rotator cuff muscles. So your rotator cuff muscles are coming from your scapula into your humerus there. And we kind of get to a fork in the road at this point. We've done the mobility through our thoracic spine. We've done the mobility through our those major internal rotators. We've looked at improving the scapular thoracic rhythm, and now we're looking at the last area to really make sure our shoulder's ready to go in the way of activity, or that we're addressing the issues at bay by looking at this last spot. So strength versus stability. When we looked at that rotator cuff group, we know that all the actions of the rotator cuff muscles are based on their rotation or that abduction, but we know that their kind of unified function is to stabilize. So when we get to this point, we kind of have to make a bit of a decision in the road. Are we more aligned to that side that is kind of entering the gym space? Are we more aligned to that side that's coming back from injury, rehabbing a joint? Or are we older and coming into the gym for the first time, or even just in someone that's over the age of 65 that's going back into that loading of the shoulder? So if we're looking at strengthening that shoulder or stabilizes the shoulder, we're looking at a exercise that allows us to load those muscles. Chris here is doing this as an external rotation with the cable machine. Now, it's external rotation, the cable machine at 45 degrees is kind of isolating that external rotators of the shoulder. And again, we're taking away from that internal bias and posturally helping that shoulder into the right position. However, if we looked at trying to improve the function, we're actually looking at an exercise that has us challenge the stability of the shoulder. So this guy here is doing a kettlebell arm bar. The kettlebells work really, really good for stability work in your shoulder when you're testing function, because he has to work pretty hard for that kettlebell not to fall left, right, or backwards, and really reach up with that shoulder to ensure that it doesn't just drop down in the shoulder blade. He's testing the Serratus Interior. He's testing a lot of things there. So there's quite a few things you could do with the kettlebell. You can even press it up like that with that underhand grip to really test the shoulder stability as well. But it's not limited to that. There's plenty of other things there as well. So we could also incorporate potentially working a bit of shoulder stability in a plank position where we're lifting one hand at a time, tapping the shoulders, or working with, say, a TRX and doing that fall out position where now it's really, really advanced, working on that shoulder stability overhead rather than just in that horizontal position there as well. So if we're summarizing all those things that we've just gone through, like that's a lot of information. How does this all kind of come together, Jake? So basically, you've gone through this to have a look at your shoulder after today's session and thought, alrighty, we're going to go through the tests that Jake does to just check on how the shoulder health is. We're going to look at our thoracic spine. We're going to look at our shoulder flexion. We're going to look at our external rotation, internal rotation, and we're going to look at our active functional range. We've taken down those measures, found out that left was worse on this, right was better on that, left was worse on this, right was better on that. From there, we've stepped across and said, all right, well, my thoracic spine was definitely terrible through my range of motion. So I'm going to double down on those two thoracic mobility exercises. I'm then going to continue on through doing some scapulothoracic movements like the upward rotation or some YTIs there to help improve my scapulothoracic control. From there, I'm going to release into my shoulder. I'm then going to look at actually testing my shoulder stability through a bit of a shoulder tap exercise, trying to test my ability to hold that shoulder position with the scapula. And then I'm going to do a test there again and see where I'm at from my previous test results. That's one way to look at it and see whether those things help address some of those issues. And if they make a big change, fantastic. The other way to look at it is to take those measures and know where you're sitting at from a shoulder function position, then integrate these, I guess, gatekeepers within your training programs or within your sports. So say, I mean, biking's a bit different because you're just holding that one position, but say it's rock climbing, for instance, and we're looking at getting onto the wall rather than starting off with solely just moving across the wall, building up a little bit of warm up through your upper body, lower body, is to actually integrate 4 of these prerequisites that lead into each other into your warm-up session. So going through each of the exercises, then doing a bit of warm-up through a maybe easy route there, going back down, doing another round of it, going through those routes again there, and then building on to your actual session. So you're kind of then managing the position you're at by mitigating any further kind of degradation that might happen because you don't have access to these different ranges there as well. Okay. Alrighty, so that's a lot of information, and I know I spat a lot of information out there, so no doubt if you haven't, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Australian accent in the Valley here, but I definitely mumble a lot, so if you need to look through that again, by all means, it's definitely one to work through a couple of times. The thing I wanted to finish off on here is that's, I think, a great takeaway for how we can kind of maintain and optimize the shoulder overall from a functional point of view. But then how can we kind of step up from a performance side of things? And that's where we have to start bringing in some additional strength training or additional stability training that might be very specific to yourself or specific to the sport that you're working in. So what I thought I'd finish off with is providing you guys with some key takeaways when it comes to strength training, rather than just feed you with a handful of exercises that I think are good for just general performance of the upper body here. So when we look at strength training, all it comes down to is biomechanics versus physics versus anatomy there. So if you see the pictures on the right, it's just a whole heap of meat on the back and a whole heap of meat on the front that help kind of create the actions of the shoulder to produce the movements that we need against the demands that we put against it. So we want to kind of think when we're looking at putting together a strength program, what areas do we want to target that are specific to our improvement of function, or what areas do we want to target that are specific to our sport, and how do we load them? So we're going to look at just solely more or less strength through a pulling and through a pushing domain, and kind of break down some key things that you should think about when deciding on like what exercises to do and how to load them there as well. So first of all, for a pulling aspect, you want to be looking at hand position, as it matters a lot. So when you go into the gym and you're looking at trying to improve your pulling strength, the often go-to for people that I see classically is just keeping those hands neutral and then just pulling and building up the load to a higher amount as you start to feel like you're improving in regards to your performance. However, if we change the hand position, we alter the demands in the back there. So as we change the hand position from a neutral position, which would kind of load more of a pattern into these rhomboids, to maybe more of a pronated position where we kind of load more into that middle trap. So pronated would be hands down, to more maybe a supinated position where we could load more into the lats there as well. You can kind of see the fibers have all their different angles. So as we change the hand position, we're actually changing what's happening at that shoulder joint each time we move. So if we're solely just moving through that neutral plane, we're kind of aligning a lot of our load through that range rather than anything horizontally and anything down through those lats and some of the larger muscles like your delts there as well. So making sure you've got a variety of hand positions when you're working vertically or horizontally on your pulling exercises and altering them throughout your training blocks. The other thing to remember as well with the pull is the intent of your pull. So it's kind of like this mind-muscle connection theory that comes in a bit as well. You see a bodybuilder's got the ability to really contract singular muscles. They can make their pecs move because they've worked that muscle group so much. They've got a real good kind of neural connection to that muscle group. When we work, say, a pull, we want to really work into the lats. We want to focus on driving our action into that muscle group rather than just focusing on solely bringing that arm up and down. It's actually have the intention of pulling it in. If we're doing a protracted pronated grip, that we're focusing on the mid traps, we want to focus on really pulling those shoulder blades together, but not driving the elbows back. So that's the kind of intention when it comes to pulling that we need to focus on. And the last one to consider is basically your arm position and how it finishes. So you see this lady here who's just basically driving her hands towards her chest as close as she can. So it means her elbows have gone right up. When we've done that, we've really driven our shoulder position quite far forward and shrugged up into the neck rather than worked through that region that she kind of wanted to work through. So when you are doing the pull, make sure you're focused on just bringing those arms by your side rather than trying to drive them back as far as you can. Bring them down and by your side rather than trying to drive them back as far. And even if they're off your side, making sure they're kind of coming to your side rather than driving again past that torso position and then bringing in that shrug position. Okay, so these are just a few examples of like the different hand positions. See this more in the mid traps. This one here getting down into your lats there as well. And then this one here is that kind of rhomboids, but we can see we're driving the elbow down into the back there, back into the hip, which is kind of getting us a bit more activation through our lats. The other thing you can note with those ranges of motion, like I'm probably coming up a bit too high with this one, but when you're reaching down and really stretching to the floor, so we're allowing that shoulder blade to really travel rather than just pinning it back against your body and only using the portion of the shoulder that moves the glenohumeral joint, the muscles that move the glenohumeral joint, rather than allowing that real big movement in the scapula there. Okay, then the last one there is the strength and pressing. So a few considerations that you want to think about when you're looking at training through strength or improving your strength through a pressing range is your output versus performance. So are we looking at trying to just bench press as much as we can? And that's our intention because we brought our ego to the gym and we wanted to intimidate everyone at the bench press, or are we actually looking to get more performance out of the shoulder? So rather than pinning those shoulders back and pushing as much as we can, do we want to actually see that shoulder blade move with the arm in the press with whatever exercise you're doing there? That could be overhead as well as horizontal there. Here, same thing as the rows. Horizontal versus overhead, are we getting a good variety of different angles in the pressing? That's going to change how we load the tissues in our shoulder. And then wide versus narrow, are we just looking at our program? Do we notice that everything we do is very wide in nature, or is everything very narrow in nature? Have we kind of missed some of the areas that we need to look at loading there for more strength and function and overall performance with our pressing motion? And then the kind of like final bit around the pressing that I wouldn't think that's worth talking about based on whether you've got good function motion. I probably don't have the license to really load above my head. Well, I know I don't have the license to load above my head because I can't control my arm above that 100 up to that 120 degrees of motion with that external rotation. So I'm gonna have to look at graduating my load overhead in that range of motion. So just a bit of an example of how you could do that would be that landmine press. You can see this guy isn't pressing very high overhead. It's just straightforward rather than, well, not straightforward, it's forward on an angle. So it's not quite overhead. He's getting good movement through his shoulder blade as he presses up. Just it's all fake mirrors. It's just good lighting, I'm sure. And then these two examples, if we can get this one to load here as well, where he's dropped down to a knee. So now he's pressing a little bit more overhead. And then And the last thing from a strength programming point of view to consider, so when you're looking at the stuff that you've got already in your strength programs, or when you're looking to build your strength programs, is first of all, leave your ego at the door. So make sure that you're not going in there trying to push as much weight as you can just for the sake of pushing load. That's not going to put you in a good position, and it's only going to lead to a time in which you hit a peak and you potentially get injured there. But in regards to intensity or volume, like how much you need to do to ensure that you're kind of creating the adaptations you need to make sure your shoulder's getting stronger, or the areas that support around the shoulder are getting, the muscles around the shoulder are getting stronger. We want to be working in general, as a general rule, to what we call 2 RIR. So this is 2 reps in reserve. So no matter what you choose for your rep range, be it 5 reps, be it 10 reps, that you've chosen a load that allows you to work to a position or work to that rep range. And when you get to that rep range, you're still in control of the movement, but you feel like you could probably only get another couple of reps in before that technique broke down due to fatigue, or that you'd only be able to really get 2 reps more in. And the reason we need that is tissues only change due to stimulus. And if you don't have enough stimulus there, we're not going to create an environment that demands change in that tissue. That changes a little bit as a recommendation if we're working totally just on skill, or like, for instance, that rotator cuff movement that you're just, or the scapular thoracic movement, we're just trying to look at getting you better at actual motor control. Different story. But if we're looking at strength, looking at 2 reps in reserve, 5 sets a week on a muscle group will maintain the strength. You want more muscle size, then sometimes longer rest breaks. If you're really working at high levels of intensity, then even longer rest breaks is probably required there as well. And basically, summarize, that was a lot of information. But I hope you were, if you stayed the whole way through, that's good on you. You managed to put up with the coughing throughout. But ultimately, with that shoulder, it's a pretty complex, with any shoulder, it's pretty complex. And I guess from a functional or performance standpoint, you ultimately just want to find out what are those key contributors that are limiting your optimal performance, potentially using the gatekeepers that we used, and then using the interventions that we did to try and address them. And if not, kind of put together a plan with what you've got here and what you need externally from others to try and address that and improve it ongoing. Beauty.
Thanks, Jake. That was excellent presentation and lots of great practical information. Some that I will actually, even just on a personal level, be applying myself. For now, being a little bit older and having just gotten back into activity after a long time out of activity, I definitely have noticed a difference in my shoulder mobility and strength that you've given me some ideas of how to assess that and hopefully mitigate some of that and improve it. So that's fantastic. Actually, I had just a question to start off with, but if anyone does have any questions, just pop them into the chat. But I just like to start off by asking Jake, in terms of the self-assessment tools that you've provided, is that the same as what, let's just say I have an injury, could I also use the same assessment tools to kind of assess where I'm at if I've had a previous shoulder injury?
Yeah, you definitely could. Like the big thing around injuries is like if you do feel like you've got some kind of clear injury that's happened as a result of a certain incident recently, like more an acute injury that's come about that needs addressing, then definitely seeing the one of the physiotherapists nearby, or a chiropractor to kind of get that addressed, because there's specific tests that they'll use to kind of diagnose what might have occurred there. But if this is something like you've had long term, you've done your due diligence in regards to rehab, and you're at a point where you're like, you know what, I've left it for a long time and I'm coming back into this, then by all means, this is going to be a good starting point for you. At the end of the day, like, what we can see from a skeletal, musculoskeletal point of view in anatomy textbook or on a model of a skeleton there is what's ideal, or what is like a classic thought of that anatomy. But every single person on this call is going to have a different design when it comes to their shoulder. And especially as we've lived our lives, we've started to get to a point, for instance, like my shoulder, and you were talking about your shoulder, has had injuries before. It's likely going to have a change in its actual anatomy and structure at this present time. So your goal is to basically outfunction poor structure. So using these measures to see where you're at with those movements, looking at whether you can use these interventions to try and outfunction this poor structure is a perfect kind of means of addressing it. But if you do have anything where you've done these things and you've had some issues going on, and you've done this for 4-6 weeks and you still haven't had any changes, then you really need to have a look at going to seeing someone about that shoulder. Good as gold. Provided too much information, no questions needed.
No, it was excellent, actually. Yeah, does anyone have any questions at all? Last chance.
If anyone has any after the call, then feel free to reach out via email or Instagram there, and I'm happy to kind of answer any questions or give any direction you might need. Yeah,
Barb just made a comment, tons to digest for sure. And yeah, just as a reminder, because we have recorded this session, I will be sending out a link to the recording to everyone, so you can certainly here's definitely some questions coming through now. Can you see those, Jake?
Yeah. Oh, there's two spread out. Okay, so any thought on swimming? As in, I think swimming's good. In relation to like improving or keeping your shoulder healthy, or I guess from a swing point of view, swimming's fantastic. It's like, I think I'm presuming what you're asking around keeping the shoulder healthy through swimming. If you think of like a knee replacement or people recovering from any knee surgeries, we put them on bikes as a means of helping with range of motion rhythmically over time, lots of reps, no load. The same thing can happen with swimming there as well. So you're doing a lot of repetitive range of motion without loading the joints. So you're creating a lot of vascularization in the area, a lot of blood flow, allowing the joint to really move through its full range of motion there. So it's fantastic from a strength point of view. You could get probably a bit of a crossover like you would if you were running on your strength of your lower body. However, you're not doing a lot from a kind of challenging stability, because we're in like a kind of supportive environment with the hydrostatic kind of support of the water rather than challenging it. And the same goes for load. So you are getting a bit of a stimulus with the resistance of the water, but I'd probably want to also include some strength training around that to ensure you're kind of doing everything within the shoulder. The other thing is, unless you're doing backstroke on top of that, you're doing a lot of internal rotation. So you'll see swimmers, climbers, the big V that they've got, those are those big lats, lots of bias to internal rotation. And you try and keep your internal rotation, then raise your hand over your head. You can't through there. So we're looking at trying to make sure we're addressing any bias of internal rotation and working on some of these muscles that help with external rotation there. Hope that answers your question there. And if I have a great range of motion, but a pinching feeling in the front of the shoulder, what is the best warm-up? It could be multifaceted. A lot of things could create that kind of pinch through there. So that'd be one where we'd have a look at for instance, going through these kind of prerequisites, having a look at what might be the area that is, I guess, a bit lower in regards to its overall function, be it thoracic spine, scapular movement, whether you're really internally biased, looking at addressing that through maybe some of the gatekeepers that we've talked about, and seeing whether that made a change, and then kind of determining which of those was the biggest influence on them, but then also remembering that that will have an influence on the other two, either side of it. So making sure you don't just use one kind of solution to fix it, but address the other two ranges above and below it. And if that doesn't create any kind of change, then having a look at going to a physiotherapist for like a further assessment, or a chiropractor. Often the pinching at the front of the shoulder can be, you know, a change of space. So the shoulder actually pushing forward in the joint, and sometimes comes about from the tension in the back of the joint. But again, it could be a lot of things. So it is quite multifaceted. So try them out, see if it makes a change. And if it does, happy days. Beauty.
Any other questions for Jake? He's a captive audience right now, so. But if not, like Jake said, so you can find him at Intrepid Performance Training. So the details are on the registration page when you signed up, or I mean, obviously you can Google it, or you can reach out to me via BSM research at banffsportmed.ca with any questions that I can pass along, or if you just have any questions in general about, you know, our education activities or any suggestions, that would be amazing. But yeah, I guess it's 8 p.m. So why don't we wrap it up? Thank you again, Jake, for providing such an excellent resource to the community tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
And we hope to host you again soon.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Alrighty, thanks.